31 days of Halloween.
Welcome to day 1 of 31 Days of Halloween, a month-long journey into the terrifying, the grotesque, and the unknown. Each day, we'll explore chilling stories that will keep you on edge, perfect for getting into the Halloween spirit. Jack Davis thought returning to his hometown would offer a fresh start, a chance to rebuild after years of turmoil. But when he discovers an old carving knife hidden among his late father's belongings, the line between past and present begins to blur. What starts as an innocent Halloween tradition soon spirals into a nightmarish descent as the carved faces of pumpkins mirror his own, and something sinister awakens, leaving Jack questioning his sanity and his fate. I had never been the type of person to believe in curses or hexes. Growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knows your name and your business, it was easy to scoff at superstition. People around here held on to old traditions, things passed down through generations, but I had always been more practical. My life was about hard work and logic, which made what happened that year all the more unsettling. It was the fall of 1979, and I had just moved back into town after a few rough years away. My name is Jack Davis, and I'd spent most of my 20s bouncing between odd jobs, trying to keep afloat after leaving the army. A dishonorable discharge wasn't something I liked talking about, but it hung over me like a scarlet letter. After being away for so long, coming home to a small-town life felt hollow. My father passed away, leaving me his rundown house and what little belongings he had left, and I thought maybe a change of pace would do me good. That's when I found the knife. Dad had left behind a lot of junk, most of it worthless. Old newspapers, rusted tools, a cracked mirror in the attic, things that spoke of a man who had long since given up. But there was one thing that caught my eye, hidden away in the attic like a secret no one was meant to find. It was a carving knife, its blade darkened with time and neglect, but there was something about it. The handle was intricately carved with swirling patterns that felt almost unnatural. They seemed to writhe under my fingers when I touched them. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that the knife was just an antique, but deep down, I felt a sense of unease. It didn't take long for me to remember the old stories my dad used to tell me. Stories about the pumpkin carver legend, a tale whispered during Halloween. Supposedly, an old man in town had been cursed, driven mad after carving a pumpkin that resembled his dead wife. He'd used a knife similar to the one in my hand, and after the pumpkin was carved, he was found with his eyes gouged out, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. I brushed it off as a coincidence, one of those ghost stories parents tell to scare their kids. But the knife intrigued me. It seemed perfect for the jack-o'-lantern I had been meaning to carve for the fall festival. So against my better judgment, I decided to use it. The blade sliced through the pumpkin with an ease that felt unnatural, as though it was alive in my hand, guiding me through each curve and jagged tooth. Before I knew it, the face I carved was complete. I stepped back and looked at it, expecting the usual satisfaction of finishing a project. But all I felt was dread. The face I had carved was mine, my own features grotesquely distorted into a monstrous grin. I stared at it for what felt like hours, my skin prickling with a fear I couldn't explain. The likeness was uncanny, and it was only then that I noticed the blood. Not on the pumpkin, but on my hand. Somewhere along the way, I had nicked my finger, but I hadn't felt it. The knife had sliced through my flesh, as easily as it had through the pumpkin, but the cut was deeper than I had thought. I wrapped a rag around my hand, my head spinning, and tried to shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I thought that would be the end of it, but things only got worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the face of the jack-o'-lantern, its crooked grin leering at me from the darkness. I tossed and turned, my mind racing, unable to shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake. The house felt different too, colder. The air was thick with a tension I couldn't explain. I kept hearing noises, scratching like something was trying to get in. But there was nothing there when I checked. In the days that followed, strange things started happening. The jack-o'-lantern I had left on the porch began to rot faster than it should have. Its flesh sagged, the once sharp features I had carved into it now grotesque and warped. And the cut on my hand, it wouldn't heal. The rag I had wrapped around it was stained dark with blood, and no matter what I did, the wound kept reopening, as though the knife had left more than just a physical mark. I told myself it was just stress, that the move and everything else were getting to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something had changed the moment I touched that knife. Then, on the 5th day, I saw him. It was late in the evening, just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. I had been sitting on the porch, nursing a beer, trying to relax, when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard. At first, I thought it was one of the neighborhood kids playing a prank, but as I squinted into the fading light, I realized that the figure was me. It was impossible, but there I was, standing at the edge of the yard, staring back at myself. My heart pounded in my chest, and I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. I stood up, my beer slipping from my hand and shattering on the porch. The sound snapped me out of my daze, and I ran inside, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, but I didn't know who to call. What would I even say? I just saw myself standing in the yard. I spent the rest of the night pacing the house, jumping at every creak and groan. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Something had followed me home. Something that wasn't me. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and strange occurrences. The figure I had seen, my doppelganger, hadn't returned, but I could feel it. There was an eerie weight in the air, a constant sensation that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. My house had become something else, a living thing, pulsing with an energy I didn't understand. It all seemed to revolve around the knife. I had shoved it into a drawer after that first night, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I passed by the drawer, it called to me. I swear I could hear it whispering, taunting me. Just one more carve, it seemed to say, but I refused to listen. I wasn't going to touch that cursed thing again. But the jack-o'-lantern on my porch, God, it had only gotten worse. Its once firm skin had turned soft and bloated, with tendrils of black mold creeping across its surface. The face I had carved, my own face, was now a twisted mockery of itself, eyes sunken in, mouth hanging in a lopsided grin. And worse, I started seeing things in it. Shadows danced behind its empty eyes, and I swear there were moments when it blinked. I told myself I was imagining things, lack of sleep, stress. It had to be that, right? I needed answers, so I did the only thing I could think of. I started digging through my father's old belongings, looking for any clue about the knife. If anyone knew something about it, it had to be him. There was no way a tool that old, that strange, didn't have some sort of story behind it. After hours of searching through boxes of dusty papers and faded photographs, I found something. It was an old journal, tucked away in the back of a drawer like a secret my father never wanted found. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but I could still make out the writing. Most of it was normal stuff, daily notes about bills, chores, complaints about the town. But then, about halfway through, the entries took a darker turn. October 1965. I found the knife in the attic today. It's strange. I don't remember ever seeing it before, but I feel like I've always known it was there. I used it to carve a pumpkin for the festival. It came out looking just like me, but distorted. It unsettles me. It feels like it's watching me. October 31st, 1965. I had a nightmare last night. I saw myself standing at the foot of the bed, staring at me with that twisted grin, the same one from the pumpkin. I woke up screaming, but the figure was still there for a moment before it vanished. I've locked the knife away, but it's still calling to me. I don't think I can resist much longer. November 3rd, 1965. I used the knife again. I didn't want to, but something made me. It's like it's in my head now, whispering. I carved another pumpkin today. It looked like Mom this time, but her eyes were hollow. I'm afraid of what will happen next. The pumpkins are rotting too fast. I don't think I can stop this. I dropped the journal, my hands trembling. My father had been through the same thing, seen the same things, and it hadn't ended well for him. I remembered the way he'd been before he died, hollow-eyed and muttering to himself. He was a shell of the man I had known, but I always thought it was the booze that did it. Now, I wasn't so sure. He had been cursed, just like I was now. The pieces were falling into place, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. The knife wasn't just a tool. It was something worse, something alive, feeding off the fear and the madness it created. I knew I should get rid of it, throw it in the river or bury it in the deepest hole I could find, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every time I thought about destroying it, I felt a wave of nausea and panic, as though my very life was tied to it now. Things escalated the night I saw my reflection move. I was in the bathroom, splashing water on my face, trying to shake off the exhaustion that clung to me like a wet blanket. When I looked up at the mirror, I froze. There I was, staring back at myself. But something was off. My reflection wasn't quite right. My eyes seemed darker, sunken, and the corners of my mouth twitched into that same sickening grin from the jack-o'-lantern. I blinked, but my reflection didn't. It just stood there grinning until it slowly raised its hand and pointed directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly slipping on the bathroom floor. The reflection followed me, pressing its face against the glass, distorting as though it was trying to break free. For a moment, I thought it would, that it would crawl out of the mirror and drag me in with it. But just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving me staring at my pale, trembling face in the mirror. I knew then that there was no escaping this. The curse was real, and it was growing stronger by the day. It was feeding on me, warping reality around me until I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The knife, the jack-o'-lantern, the reflection, they were all connected, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. That night, the scratching came back, louder this time. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening as something scraped along the walls outside. It moved slowly, methodically, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps, A pause. Then 3 more. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was frozen with fear. The knocking continued, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. It didn't stop until I finally forced myself to get up. I stumbled to the front door, heart pounding in my ears, and peered through the peephole. No one was there, but I knew, deep down, that something was waiting for me. I wish I could say that I never opened the door. I wish I could tell you that I had the sense to walk away, to burn the house down, and leave town without looking back. But something compelled me to turn the knob that night, something that wasn't me. It felt like my hands were acting of their own will, shaking as they twisted the lock and pulled the door open. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the biting chill of October air. But it wasn't the cold that made me shiver. No, it was what stood at the foot of the porch, what had come for me. The figure was tall and hunched, its body cloaked in rags that fluttered in the breeze. In the dim light of the porch, I could just make out its face, or rather, the grotesque absence of one. Its head was shaped like a pumpkin, but not just any pumpkin. It was the jack-o'-lantern I had carved days ago. Only now, it stood on legs, gnarled and twisted like dead tree branches. The same hideous grin stretched across its rotting face, eyes hollow but burning with something far worse than malice. I took a step back, choking on the bile rising in my throat. The stench of decay hit me, thick and suffocating. It radiated from the creature like a disease, infecting everything it touched. The grass at its feet withered and blackened. The wood of the porch cracked under its weight. My voice caught in my throat. What the hell was I supposed to say? My mind was reeling, scrambling for any sense of reason, but there was none to be found. This thing, this monster, it had come from the jack-o'-lantern, from the curse tied to the knife, and now it wanted something from me. Its head tilted slightly, as if it were considering me, weighing my worth like a butcher sizing up meat. The silence was unbearable. Then it spoke, or at least, I think it did. The words came not from its mouth, but from everywhere at once, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. You carved it. Now, you are part of it. My skin crawled as the words sank in. Part of it? My head spun with confusion and dread. What did it mean? Was I to become like it, or was I already becoming something else? I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The creature stepped closer, its every movement slow and deliberate, as though savoring my fear. Suddenly, the house behind me groaned, the walls creaking and shifting as though alive. The air inside grew thick and foul, the smell of rot seeping through the open door. I could hear something moving inside, something dragging itself through the hallways, inching closer with every second. I had no doubt. It was coming for me, too. The jack-o'-lantern creature raised one skeletal arm and pointed directly at my chest. For a moment, I thought it would strike me down right there, but instead, it reached out its other hand. An offer. I stared at the gnarled fingers, realizing it wanted me to take its hand. Panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut, bolting it with every lock I could find. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat louder than the last as I backed away. The house felt like it was breathing, walls contracting and expanding in rhythm with my own panic. From the kitchen, I heard the soft scrape of metal on wood, and my heart dropped into my stomach. The knife. I had left it in the drawer, but now it was out. Somehow, it had found its way to the counter, standing upright, its blade glinting in the faint light. As if it had a life of its own, It began to move slowly across the counter, dragging itself toward me. I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. Every step was an agonizing effort. The walls around me seemed to close in, squeezing tighter, forcing me toward the knife. I could hear my father's voice echoing in my mind, his final journal entries repeating over and over. I don't think I can stop this. My vision blurred as the weight of the curse bore down on me. The knife was closer now, so close I could almost feel the cold steel against my skin. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall, my breath coming in short gasps. And then I saw it. The reflection. Across the room, in the cracked mirror, there he was again. My reflection, only it wasn't mine. The grin, that same twisted, mocking smile, stretched across his face, eyes dark and sunken. He raised his hand, mimicking my movements, but there was something different. In his hand was the knife. I was trapped. The reflection in the mirror grinned wider, a sickening parody of my own terror. He lifted the knife to his throat, and in one fluid motion, drew the blade across his neck. Blood splattered across the glass, but it didn't stop there. It seeped through the mirror, dripping onto the floor, as though the barrier between reality and whatever nightmare world this thing came from had shattered. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat burned, my vision darkened, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was that twisted grin, growing wider, hungrier. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, covered in bandages and hooked up to machines. The doctors said they had found me on my front porch, unconscious and bleeding from a deep gash on my hand. They asked if I had tried to hurt myself, but I couldn't remember. All I knew was that the knife was gone. They said I was lucky to be alive, but I didn't feel lucky. The nightmares haven't stopped. Every time I close my eyes, I see the jack-o'-lantern, its grin wider than ever. And every time I wake up, there's a new cut on my body. They're small, barely noticeable, but I know what they mean. The curse isn't over. The knife is still out there, waiting for me. And when it comes back, I know it won't be alone.